that we have a presentation from the county staff first to briefly outline the proposal, the intent, the impacts, and the limitations of the proposal.
Good morning, members of the board. Robert Miller, Director of Animal Services. Staff have prepared a brief presentation this morning for you. Before you today is the County of Riverside Mandatory Pitbull Spay and Neuter Ordinance, Ordinance number 921. So this ordinance requires an unincorporated Riverside County that all pitbull and pitbull mixed dogs over the age of 4 months to be spayed or neutered. Exemptions: currently licensed dogs whose owners are registered breeders, law enforcement canines, assistant dogs per Food and Agricultural Code 30850, dogs whose health conditions preclude surgery as certified by a California licensed veterinarian, dogs licensed in another jurisdiction and in training at a licensed kennel in the county, in or during the time when a breeding determination is required. Of all the licensed dogs in unincorporated Riverside County, pit bulls represent 9.75%, of which 19% are intact. Intact pits represent 1.8% of the total licensed dog population. There are currently more than 500,000 licensed dogs in our county. 29% of intact pits are microchipped. 37% of altered pits are microchipped. Of all the licensed dogs in unincorporated Riverside County, Chihuahuas represent 18.1%, of which 7.3% are intact. Chihuahuas happen to be the second most represented breed within the sheltering impound system, and so it's a comparison we were trying to draw. Intact Chihuahuas represent 1.3% of the population. 34.6% of intact Chihuahuas are microchipped. 37.9% of altered Chihuahuas are chipped. Of all the licensed dogs in unincorporated Riverside County, all other breeds represent 72%, of which 8.8% are intact. Intact other breeds represent 6.3% of the population. 34% of intact other breeds are microchipped, 37% of altered other breeds are chipped, similar to Chihuahuas. Now we have some data cells that I'm going to let Dr. Drusi present to you.
Good morning, board. What you have before you is a map. One of the things that the board considered in the past was the negative impact that pit bulls and pit bull crosses have to the health, safety, and welfare of the community. This map represents dog bite cases from 2012. The large push pins, represent the pit bulls. The small red dots represent Chihuahuas, and the larger kind of purplish dots represent all the other breeds. As you can imagine, the bites are concentrated in areas where people live, people with their dogs, whether they're licensed or not. And the following graph represents a closer look at western Riverside County, where you can see more clearly how concentrated some of the attacks on people have been. As a matter of fact, we have used some of this information to send licensed inspectors out into those communities to further compliance with not only the pit bulls but other unlicensed dogs. We have about 1,000 dog bites a year in the county. Pit bulls and pit bull crosses represent about 27 or 28% of those bite cases, whereas Chihuahuas are 11%, and then 61% would be all the other breeds of dogs combined. These numbers are reflected almost identically in our complete service area, which would be the next graph, or when we just look at the unincorporated county areas. In addition to the health and safety issues relative to pit bull bites and attacks on people, the impact these animals have on the sheltering system is also very great. We impound about 4,000 pit bulls a year. They represent 20% of all the dogs that the department impounds. As you can see from this chart, clearly 3,000 of those 4,000 pit bulls are euthanized. There are some very nice dogs in that population that were euthanized. They appear to be very nice. The problem is people don't necessarily want to adopt them. And they may have some behavioral aspects that do not manifest themselves immediately, food aggression being one. If they're housed in a kennel by themselves, they're obviously not demonstrating aggressive tendencies towards people or to other dogs, but these are factors that negatively influence the willingness of the public to adopt these animals. A close look at the chart will see that the rescue groups take intact animals, whereas the adoptions are all altered animals. Well, state law has had us for the last 15 years the provision that we alter every animal that's adopted, whereas that dictum is transferred to the rescue groups when they pull animals from our shelters. You may ask, why do they pull intact ones? Because they're pulling puppies for the most part. But the puppies haven't had a chance to get altered just yet, and the puppies are certainly more adoptable than the adult population. As a matter of fact, as of 7 a.m. this morning, in the Riverside shelter alone, there were 439 dogs. 93 of those dogs were pit bulls, or pit bull mixes. 24 of those dogs were less than a year old. That means 60 of those pit bull dogs in our Riverside shelter were adults. Only very infrequently do patrons, do your constituents come into the shelters and adopt a 2, 3, 5-year-old pit bull especially. They may adopt that golden retriever, that Labrador that has some age to them. Those dogs will actually get rescued out as well. The pit bull rescue groups are filled with dogs, and it is very difficult to move them along. The final chart represents a chronology of the number of dog bite cases. You may observe that there seems to be a decline in cases over the last 5 years. I need a little more time to be able to convince myself that that is indeed a trend. This is our service area. We receive all the unincorporated area and the contract cities. Correct. You may want to compare that with cat bites. Cat bites only make up about 200 bite cases a year, but we all acknowledge that whether it's a cat bite or a dog bite, those reports, those incidents are underreported. There's certainly a lot more in the community that never reach our desk.
And I would actually submit that cat bites are more dangerous than dog bites in terms of the post-bite infection and complication possibilities. So essentially, board members, this ordinance would require all pit bulls and pit bull mixes to be spayed or neutered after 4 months of age. It would include currently licensed intact dogs as well. It would effectively make spay-neuter status a condition of licensure moving forward. It would provide a process of appeal for breed identification, be enforced through administrative citation or as a misdemeanor, provide violations with appeals as enumerated in Riverside County Ordinance number 630. Some of the concerns we've heard over the pit bull dog population, and I just want to say right up front that for the department, the issue is much more of a population-based problem. In other words, our impound system, the cost to the taxpayers to house and care for this 20% of our dog population is the greatest problem. That is not to try to minimize the public safety and health threats or fears. But the first priority of this board should be addressing the ongoing impoundment of a gross overpopulation of this particular breed. The media has obviously covered significant dog bite incidents, including death. We had a new case just yesterday, I think it was in Rialto, where we had 2 children that were attacked by a pit bull, and eventually a neighbor, Good Samaritan, ended up dispatching the pit bull with his shotgun. And unfortunately, we are hearing these stories more and more in the press. Now, I can't tell you today that it's necessarily an increase in the number of attacks simply by pit bulls, or whether or not it's being followed more closely by the media. I think it's an attractive story, but there are other dog breeds that do bite people, and those are certainly reported. Those statistics are tracked nationally. The problem that we see with pit bulls, though, is that the bite is usually pretty vicious in nature. It does a lot of damage. If a Chihuahua bites a child, most of the time the bite damage will not be significant. Unless we're talking about a 6-month-old baby who's over by the food bowl and puts their face right up to it, and the Chihuahua gets a bite into the face, it's usually not significant damage. The other problem that we see with pit bulls is that pit bulls tend, when they get into that high arousal state, they can tend to continue to bite and continue attack. With a lot of other breeds, we see one bite occur, and then they back off from it. So this causes complications for us as an enforcement department. Obviously, these dogs are highly muscular. They have overdeveloped jaw muscles. These dogs were bred to emphasize aggression, and they were bred for dominant behavior. Of the licensed dogs in the unincorporated county, only 5% represent pit bulls. For a dog that 1/5 of every dog we impound is a pit bull. 20% of all impounded dogs in the system are pit bulls, like I discussed. Dr. Drusi covered that over 4,000 dogs per year, and 80% of these dogs are intact when they come into our system. Only about 10% are adopted. We've done some studies on our data. We've mined our database to look more closely at the pit bull problem, and we have found that these dogs need to be a year, preferably 6 months or younger, to get adopted, so they need to be a puppy. They're usually adopted within the first 24 to 48 hours once they clear their holding time and become available for adoption. And every day beyond that, the chances for adoption become exponentially worse for them. So that's another staggering statistic for the pit bulls. Including euthanasia requests, the euthanasia rate of pit bulls approaches 75 to 80%. 30% of all dogs euthanized in our shelters are pit bulls or pit bull mixes. Now, those are, I think, very staggering statistics. Now, I am actually done with the presentation, but I want to make a few points before I hand this back over to the chairman. We had a conference call last week with Humane Society of the United States, Jennifer Fearing, and one of her colleagues, and to discuss this issue. And the department made 2 suggestions that we would like to present to the board. One would be that the department currently posts their animal impound statistics and outcome statistics on the department's website. We would suggest that the department start pulling the pit bull. We would still leave the current reports that are up, but we would report pit bulls separately so that interested people in the public could track the statistics of impounds, outcomes, bites, licensure, those types of things. The other suggestion that we made to HSUS was to have an annual report on this ordinance that comes forward to the board as a receive and file once a year that really outlines and demonstrates the effectiveness or non-effectiveness of the ordinance, and that allows the public once again to get more information on an annual basis. The last comment that I wanted to make is that I've spoken to a few breeders, people that are actively involved in showing their dogs, and right now the breeder exemption does not have a component in it that allows for people who just show. They don't really breed, maybe they only have one dog. They're just active in the showing of that dog. And my suggestion to the board to tackle this issue would be currently under Ordinance 921, under Section 4 Exemptions A, it says currently licensed pit bulls whose owners are registered breeders with the county's Department of Animal Services. Now, for the board, you may not know this, right now the definition and policy behind a registered breeder is a policy by the department. And so we can make fluid changes to the policy without having to bring the ordinance package back. So my suggestion would be that the department revise the current policy for registered breeders, and we make it the definition a little bit broader for registered breeder, and we include the title of show or shower, and then we will allow that exemption, and the only things they would have to provide is proof of affiliation, proof of activity in terms of showing these animals. And we do have some local breeders that we could work with to help refine the criteria for that. And then we could bring that back as a receive and file to the board so that there's a public record of those changes. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for your presentation. It is, I believe, a very compelling argument. I'd like to just make a couple of comments. You spoke about the overpopulation and the cost to the county, and while I would agree that's a significant concern, I think a far bigger concern, my concern, is that whatever number of factors coalesce to create this result, Riverside County had to pay to kill 3,000 innocent animals last year. And in a disproportionate number of the animals that are killed are of this one breed, again, because of a lot of reasons why people do not generally walk into a shelter and want to adopt. So once they become wards of the county of Riverside, they're in serious trouble. And I just get very, very tired at our meetings about hearing how many pit bulls we had to put down, euthanize, kill. That's my number one concern, number one reason I support doing what we can to reasonably and logically limit the population of that particular breed. There's also a very legitimate concern about some of the attributes of some of the pit bulls, but by and large, that to me is not the compelling argument. The compelling argument is just the fact that we end up killing so many of them. On the issue of publicizing on the website the number of euthanasias and specifically calling out the breed, I would say publish all breeds. And publish them by the number that you had to do every month. And I guarantee you, based on what I've seen, the number one is going to be pit bulls every month. That would be compelling argument enough without discriminating and just publishing the euthanasia of one breed. So those are my comments. Supervisor Stone, do you want to speak now? We have the number. We have 12 or 15 public speakers. Do you want to start that? Sure, go ahead.
Couple questions, that's all. Robert, as part of the exemptions, you say currently licensed dogs whose owners are registered breeders. Who registers those breeders? Are they registered within our county, or is there another organization that does that?
Well, under this definition, they're registered with the department. And the current, yes, with your Department of Animal Services. Now, but interesting enough, one of the requirements to be a registered breeder is to have a county business license. So, in that regard, we have zero. The other requirement they have to have is have a California seller's permit, because the state says that if you sell 2 or more of anything, which includes dogs and cats, and they've been very clear on this, that they have to have a California seller's permit.
Okay. And Dr. Drusi, you of course have studied animals, you're a doctorate in veterinary medicine. Has a pit bull through the ages always been this vicious dog that the media portrays them to be? Or have we somehow genetically engineered them to be the vicious animals that, you know, kill people and maim people? who's created this viciousness?
Your question is, who's to blame?
Yeah.
Society is to blame. It is not necessarily engineering, it is selection. And through the apparent infinite wisdom of society, we have decided long ago to select out those attributes that we find most pleasing, either from a cosmetic or appearance standpoint, or from a performance standpoint. The sled dogs that you see in Iditarod did not become sled dogs overnight. There was generations of breeding a dog that could withstand those conditions and have the endurance. The same thing holds true, unfortunately, with pit bulls. They were bred in the past to be aggressive. They were bred to be fighting dogs, frankly. And it has taken hundreds of years to get to that point. Breeding in the 21st century, a couple generations is not going to eliminate that from the genetic pool.
Okay, so you pretty much answered my question that through genetic selection of very ambitious, aggressive dogs, we've created this environment where they might be really cute puppies in the pound, but these animals could grow to be very vicious, dangerous animals to children and adults, as we witnessed. We often see on television dog shows AKC. Does AKC recognize pit bulls as a show dog?
No, they don't. The UKC does, however.
Okay, okay. I'm concerned that since AKC doesn't really recognize these dogs as, wearing these fancy little costumes and doing nice little walks and getting awards, and based on your testimony that these dogs have been bred to be dangerous animals, and I certainly share the concern with Supervisor Chairman Benoit that putting down 3,000 animals is unfortunate and it's very expensive, but I think the paramount importance of this ordinance is we need to protect the public from these vicious animals that have been engineered to cause bodily injury. And you mentioned that as a part of the dog licensing program, Robert, that you have 0 of these breeders getting licenses. I mentioned this at the last meeting. I think that because this is kind of an aberration of the pet industry, why don't we do a Cal ID on these breeders to make sure that they're breeding these animals for appropriate reasons, not to make vicious animals that jeopardize the health and safety of our residents. I don't know, County Council, if that's something that we can include in this ordinance, but that might help us keep track of those people that may have, felonious crimes associated with their past that we may not want breeding in this county. Council, can we include that language?
If you want to include that language, you need to revise it and bring it back. But today, what you have before you is adoption of this ordinance.
That's all.
Supervisor, I'd like to just chime in on that. Currently, the registration of breeders is through the department, and it's set by department policy. It is not set by ordinance. And so we could make that change for Cal ID at the department level without having to bring the ordinance back.
Thank you. I'd like you to pursue that.